Wisconsin, summer 1944. The truck rumbled past a weathered mailbox at the end of a dirt road. The name painted in neat black letters, Schmidt Family Farm, Est, 1872. Hans Müller, 28, from Hamburg, pressed his face against the wire mesh, reading that name again and again, certain he'd misunderstood. The propaganda had been clear. Americans hated Germans, had abandoned their heritage, were enemies without shared history. But here was a Schmidt farm in Wisconsin, and there would be more. By evening, these German prisoners would discover that half the farms in this county bore names identical to their own. Müller, Weber, Hoffman, Fischer, the enemy, it turned out, spoke their grandfather's language and remembered songs their mothers had sung. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story from history, hit that like button and subscribe to stay connected to these untold moments from World War II. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this video with anyone who appreciates real history. Now let's continue. Hans sat back from the wire mesh, his mind reeling. Everything he'd been taught was collapsing with each passing mailbox. In that moment, staring at German names on American farmland, he realized the propaganda had been hiding something far more dangerous than enemy strength. It had been hiding the truth that Germans had chosen to leave and had prospered wildly by doing so. Camp McCoy sat in the rolling farmland of central Wisconsin, surrounded by dairy country that looked more like Bavaria than America was supposed to look. The landscape featured gentle hills, forests of pine and birch, lakes that reflected sky so perfectly they seemed like portals to another world. Hans had arrived in May 1944, part of a group of Afrika Korps prisoners captured in Tunisia. Shipped across the Atlantic, processed through East Coast facilities, then sent to Wisconsin because dairy farmers needed labor and German prisoners needed somewhere to wait out the war's end. The numbers told a story the regime had never mentioned. By 1944, over 8 million Americans claimed German ancestry. Wisconsin alone had nearly 300,000 residents who spoke German at home. They'd built churches, schools, entire towns where German was the primary language. They'd named their communities New Berlin, Germantown, New Holstein. They'd established the largest brewing industry in America, created dairy cooperatives that rivaled anything in Europe, and built farms that made German agriculture look primitive by comparison. But the propaganda had prepared Hans for something entirely different. American cities full of gangsters and poverty. American soldiers who were soft, undisciplined, reliant on technology rather than true military valor. American citizens who were mongrel mixtures of every failed culture, lacking the purity and purpose that defined the German state. What the propaganda hadn't prepared him for was discovering that Wisconsin was essentially a German colony transplanted to North America, that the enemy spoke his language, ate his food, remembered his heritage with a pride the regime had tried to claim as exclusively German. The first work detail came 3 days after arrival. 20 prisoners loaded onto a truck, 2 guards riding along more from procedure than necessity, heading out to local farms that needed help with spring planting and fence repair. Hans sat near the back, watching countryside pass by, noting how different it looked from Hamburg's industrial landscape or North Africa's endless sand. This was agricultural heartland, prosperous and green, showing no signs of war's deprivation. No evidence of the desperate shortage propaganda had promised. The truck passed farms with names that made Hans do double takes. Schneider Dairy, Brown family farm, the Wagner place. Each mailbox was a small shock. Each German surname a contradiction, a propaganda that insisted Americans had no culture, no heritage worth preserving, no connection to anything older than their mongrel nation's brief history. Werner Koch, sitting beside Hans, noticed the names too. He was 31, from Munich, a farmer before conscription, someone who understood agriculture at a bone-deep level that city-bred soldiers couldn't match. "Look at the names," Werner whispered in German, keeping his voice low so the guards wouldn't think they were planning something. "Schmidt, Müller, Hoffman. These are our names. Maybe captured and changed," Hans suggested, trying to reconcile observation with propaganda. "Prisoners from previous wars forced to farm enemy land." Werner shook his head. "These farms say established 1872, founded 1868. That's before our grandparents were born. These aren't prisoners. These are German immigrants, Germans who chose America, Germans who prospered here." The truck pulled into a long driveway, passing under an archway that read Hoffman Farm since 1881. The farmhouse was large, well-maintained, painted white with green shutters. The barn was enormous, larger than anything Hans had seen in Germany, built from stone and timber that suggested permanence rather than expedience. An older man emerged from the barn as the truck stopped. He was maybe 60, with a weathered face that spoke of decades working outdoors, with bearing that suggested authority earned rather than assumed. He wore overalls and a straw hat, looking exactly like every propaganda image of the simple American farmer, except his name was Friedrich Hoffman. And when he greeted the guards, his English carried an accent that Hans recognized immediately, the thick, guttural sounds of someone whose first language was German, whose mouth shaped English words with Germanic precision. The prisoners descended from the truck, forming a loose line. Hoffman looked them over with an expression that mixed assessment with something else. Sadness, maybe, or recognition of shared tragedy. One of the guards, a young man named Thompson, who couldn't have been more than 22, addressed Hoffman in English. "Got 20 men for you today, Mr. Hoffman, the usual work." Hoffman nodded, then surprised everyone by addressing the prisoners directly in German. "Guten Tag, mein Herren. Welcome to my farm. I understand you're here to work. I'll treat you fairly, feed you well, and if you work hard, we'll get along fine." The prisoners stood in stunned silence. An American farmer speaking German. Not broken German, not heavily accented, but proper German with a Bavarian regional dialect that several prisoners recognized instantly. Hans found his voice first. "You speak German, sir?" Hoffman smiled slightly. "Of course I speak German. It's my first language. Grew up speaking it at home and church at school. Didn't learn proper English until I was nearly 20. But you're American," Hans struggled with the contradiction. "I'm both," Hoffman said simply. "Born in Wisconsin, but my parents came from Bavaria in 1879. They brought their language, their customs, their way of farming. I was raised German in America, and I see no contradiction in that." He gestured toward the fields stretching behind the farmhouse. "My father bought this land for almost nothing. 60 acres of forest and swamp. Spent 30 years clearing it, draining it, turning it into productive farmland. Built this barn with his own hands. Raised 7 children. Created something that will last. That's the American dream, boys. That's what we do here." Werner spoke up, his voice carrying genuine confusion. "But we're at war. Germany and America. How can you speak our language, claim our heritage, and fight against your own people. Hoffman's expression hardened slightly. Germany is not my people anymore. My people are Americans. Some with German names, some with Irish names, some with Polish names. All of them united by choice rather than blood. We left Germany because we wanted something better, freedom, opportunity, land we could own outright rather than rent from aristocrats. We succeeded. We built good lives. And when Germany started this war, started conquering Europe, started doing, he paused, seeming to search for words, started doing unspeakable things. We sided with America without hesitation, because this is our country now, and Germany is just the place our grandparents left behind. The words hit like physical blows. Hans had never considered that German immigrants might have reasons for leaving, might have actively chosen America over Germany, might view the old country as something less appealing than propaganda claimed. They worked through the morning, mending fences along the property's northern boundary. The work was hard, but straightforward, pulling old posts, digging new holes, setting cedar posts that would last decades, stretching wire until it sang with tension. Hoffman worked alongside them, not supervising from a distance, but actually laboring, his 60-year-old body moving with efficiency that came from a lifetime of farm work. He spoke mostly in German, explaining techniques, discussing soil conditions, treating them as workers rather than prisoners. Around noon, a bell rang from the farmhouse. Hoffman straightened, wiped sweat from his forehead. "Lunch," he announced. "Come up to the house. My wife's been cooking all morning." They walked up to the farmhouse, uncertain what to expect. The guards followed, equally curious. The house was beautiful up close, well-maintained, with flower gardens that showed care and attention, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, inviting people to sit and watch the world pass by. Mrs. Hoffman met them at the door, a woman in her late 50s, gray-haired with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She spoke in German with the same Bavarian accent her husband carried. Come in. I've made lunch for everyone. Sit wherever you can find space." The dining room was large, dominated by a massive oak table that could seat 20. They crowded around it, prisoners and guards mixing together, unified by hunger and curiosity about what an American farmhouse meal might entail. Mrs. Hoffman brought out food that made Hans's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Bratwurst. Real bratwurst made from pork and proper seasonings, served with sauerkraut and potato salad. Rye bread, dark and dense, sliced thick and spread with real butter. Kartoffelsalat made exactly the way his mother made it back in Hamburg. This wasn't American food. This was German food, prepared in German style, served in an American farmhouse by people who claimed both identities without contradiction. Werner took a bite of bratwurst, closed his eyes, let out a sound halfway between laugh and sob. "This tastes like home," he said quietly. "Exactly like home." Mrs. Hoffman smiled. "My mother's recipe. She brought it from Bavaria in 1879 and taught it to me. I've made bratwurst every Saturday for 40 years. Why would I stop just because the world went mad?" Hans ate slowly, tasting childhood in every bite. Saturday dinners in Hamburg, when his family was still intact and food carried no meaning beyond nourishment and continuity. After lunch they returned to work, but something had shifted. The prisoners spoke more freely with Hoffman, asking about his farm, his life, how German immigrants had built Wisconsin's dairy industry into something rivaling Europe. Hoffman answered patiently, understanding these weren't idle questions. but attempts to reconcile propaganda with reality. My father used to say, Hoffman explained as they dug post holes, that Germans make excellent Americans because we understand hard work, education, craftsmanship. But America made us better Germans because it removed aristocracy and militarism and let us succeed by merit. But the regime says, Hans began, then stopped, hearing how hollow it sounded. The regime says many things, Hoffman replied quietly. Mostly lies meant to rule through fear. I wrote relatives explaining America wasn't weak or doomed. Some stopped writing. Some feared contact. Some wrote calling me a traitor to German blood. He paused. The letters stopped in 1941. I assume they're dead or learned hard lessons about ideology. He drove his shovel harder. War destroys families even before bullets fly. On Sunday, Hoffman asked if prisoners could attend church. A Lutheran service in town was held in German. The commander agreed. A truck carried 15 prisoners to New Holstein, a town founded by immigrants who remembered their homeland while building something new. The stone church, built in 1889, smelled of wood, hymns, and candle wax. The congregation farmers and families looked at the prisoners with curiosity and sadness, not hatred. The service was conducted in German by Reverend Weber. His sermon spoke of division and reconciliation, of loving enemies. Many of us have family in Germany, Weber said. This war divides families, but we need not choose between American identity and German heritage. We can fight tyranny while loving those deceived by it. Afterward, congregants approached the prisoners, offering comfort and cookies made from old family recipes. Mrs. Schneider gripped Hans's hand. My son is fighting in France, she said. Maybe against your family, but God is bigger than war. Hans understood then why propaganda insisted Americans had no culture. If soldiers learned millions of Americans were essentially Germans who had chosen a better system, the ideology collapsed. In the following weeks, the pattern repeated farms with German names. Immigrants who'd arrived in the 1800s, cleared land, built prosperity, kept language and customs while becoming American. Hans was often assigned to the Hoffman farm, where Friedrich treated him as an apprentice, teaching advanced dairy techniques and cooperative economics. One evening, watching sunset over the fields, Hans asked, How do you reconcile being German and American fighting the country your family came from? My grandfather left Bavaria because he had no future there, Hoffman said. Here, he homesteaded land. In 2 generations, we went from tenants to owners. That was impossible under the old system. But loyalty to Germany? I'm loyal to German culture and values, Hoffman replied, not to the regime. That's a perversion of everything good. I fight it because I love what Germany should be, a nation of free people. Sometimes you must burn down the rotten barn to build something better. And after the war? Hans asked. What happens to Germany then? Hopefully Germans remember what your ancestors knew before the regime poisoned everything, Hoffman said. That freedom matters more than national glory. That prosperity comes from opportunity rather than conquest. You're young. You'll survive this war. When you go home, help rebuild. Remember what you've seen here. Germans succeeded in America because the system allowed it. Build that system in Germany. When summer turned to fall, prisoners were allowed to write censored letters home. Hans wrote to his mother in Hamburg, assuming she was still alive. Dear Mother, I am well and treated fairly. The camp is in Wisconsin, full of Germans who are also Americans. I work on a farm owned by a man named Hoffman from Bavaria. He speaks German like grandfather did, cooks food like you did, and keeps traditions we thought were uniquely German. I've learned something important. We were lied to about America. They are not weak or doomed. They are Germans, Irish, Poles, Italians who chose freedom over autocracy and built prosperity through hard work. The man I work for values education, craftsmanship, and family traditions, but also individual liberty and merit. When I come home, I will carry these lessons. Germany can rebuild, but only by building something different, one that respects individual rights and allows people to prosper without conquest. I miss you. I pray you're safe. Your son, Hans. He folded the letter and hoped it would reach her. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Hans and Werner were scheduled for repatriation in August to the American zone. The final weeks passed quickly. Hans worked until the last day, absorbing everything he could. On that day, Friedrich gave him a brown paper package. Don't open it until you're on the ship. It's everything I think you'll need. Thank you, Hans said, for treating us like people, for proving the propaganda was lies. Write to me, Friedrich said. I want to know how Germany rebuilds. Atlantic Ocean, August 1945. Hans opened the package on deck. Inside were a Hoffman family photo album documenting generations of prosperity, notes on Wisconsin dairy cooperatives, a German-English dictionary filled with handwritten notes, letters of introduction to German-American aid groups, and a personal letter. Dear Hans, you're returning to a devastated Germany. The task ahead is not just rebuilding infrastructure, but rebuilding character and values. You've learned that German heritage can thrive without authoritarian control. Use that knowledge. Resist any return to tyranny. Freedom is harder, but worth it. Maintain contact with German Americans we want to help. Remember, you are not responsible for what the regime did, but you are responsible for what Germany becomes next. Build something worthy of our heritage. Your friend, Friedrich Hoffman. Hans read it 3 times, understanding why propaganda had insisted Americans had no culture, because the truth would have shattered everything. Werner joined him at the rail. What's in the package? Hope, Hans said. Proof we don't have to repeat the past. Think anyone will listen? Enough will, Hans replied, tucking the letter over his heart. Germany can't afford to be wrong again. The ship cut through Atlantic waters, carrying prisoners toward an uncertain future. But Hans carried something else. Knowledge that heritage transcended borders, that culture survived political systems, that the best version of any tradition was the one that existed by choice rather than compulsion. German names on Wisconsin mailboxes had shattered propaganda more effectively than any military defeat. The enemy had spoken his language, cooked his food, maintained his heritage, and prospered by choosing freedom. That simple truth would help rebuild a nation and redeem a culture that the regime had tried to make synonymous with oppression. The war had taught Hans many lessons, but the most important came not from battle, but from a farmhouse porch in Wisconsin, where an old man with a Bavarian accent proved that being German and being free were not contradictions, but complementary truths waiting to transform a defeated nation into something worthy of its own heritage.